Hi, this is Sharon Fisher with another highlight from the South by Southwest 2014 Gaming Expo. Geoff Keighley sat down with Jade Raymond, the managing director of Ubisoft Toronto, to talk about her career, the future at Ubisoft in her Toronto studio, and where she sees the landscape of gaming today.
I've seen a lot of game teams. I think once a team itself even ships a game, you kind of start, after a little while, let's say, getting sick of the environment, the setting or whatever. How many games do you want to make in this exact setting over and over again? And so it wasn't only about thinking about a franchise that could live for a long time and be interesting for different people to play or watch in different media, but also that the team would be excited to continue working on it. So that's something that Patrice and I spent a long time, and Corey, talking about.
Yeah, amazing how you architected that, and then that game really sort of took on a life of its own with the amount of press and attention it got, being seen as sort of one of the first true next-gen games for the sort of Xbox 360, PlayStation 3 era. And you also got to have sort of a whirlwind press tour, and a lot of attention around that. What was that time like for you when you look back at that? Obviously a lot of intense interest in sort of the game and
It was very stressful. I remember the last 3 months of production, I didn't sleep. I remember I was at Tokyo Game Show, and Yves had invited me to have breakfast with them, and he wanted to ask how development was going. And he's like, "Well, Jade, you did a good job of generating interest." He's like, "Now you got to deliver." I was like, "Oh yeah." No pressure.
But it's also interesting to see Assassins. One was a good game, and I think two really, fix a lot of the things that you guys were fully happy with in the first one.
Yes.
It's nice to see sort of you. There was so much interest that I think people gave you guys a couple games to really sort of nail.
Yeah,
Assassins.
we were really lucky with that. I don't think you could do that anymore in this day and age. You've got to, unless you were, I guess, following the early access model.
Right, you're right. That's the thing. There was a rush to get that out, and then I think two and everything. Now it's become obviously a legendary franchise. New games coming out every year. So after Assassin's Creed, you worked very intently on that. Ubisoft Toronto was in the picture. For those of you guys may or may not know how big Ubisoft Toronto is, but Jason called us about it when we were prepping for this. I didn't realize how many people you have there. That was a big initiative to start a studio in Toronto, my hometown, which when I was growing up, there was really very little in the way of game development. The Dragon's Lair guys were there. That was about it. And now it's really cool that you have this studio in downtown Toronto, and Ubisoft is known for, one of its strategies is to find sort of new parts of the world to develop games in that don't have a lot of other competitors or other developers in those towns. So what was the appeal to you of, something like Toronto, and this was, a big opportunity for you to really found not only a franchise, but start a studio?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I was 8 months pregnant for my daughter, our first kid, and Yanis called me into his office, and he said, Jade, and I thought he was calling me into his office to just say, let's talk about your maternity leave and how long you'll be gone and where the status is of handing things off. And he goes, I'm going to ask you if you want to do something that's going to be surprising that I'm asking now. And I'm like, okay. And then he said, would you like to go to Toronto to start up a new studio? I was like, did you not notice that we're about to have a baby? So at first I said no, because I had a pretty amazing job in Montreal. I was responsible for the Assassin's Creed franchise, and I was also working on 2 new IP. One of them that's now announced, Watch Dogs. I was working with that team early on, and I was also working on Mighty Quest for Epic Loot with that team. And so there was I was getting to work on interesting projects, and so I was and about to have a baby. So I was like, no, Yanis, no thank you, things are good. But after thinking about it, it was really an opportunity I couldn't refuse, because it was the perfect opportunity to build something from scratch and get the whole startup feeling of, setting up the culture that you really want, and, building a team and all the things that I find really exciting, and also with the backing of Ubisoft and the support of Ubisoft. And so after thinking about it, I really couldn't say no. And a big thing that made the decision easy for me too was I got to go with an amazing team of people. So Alex Parizeau and Max Benin and a few of the people I admire most who were working in Montreal at the time came with me to start the studio, so I wasn't all by myself doing it. Well, I mean, as much as AI can be great and generate interesting challenges, it's always going to be the same when it's AI. Whereas when you're playing with people, it adds randomness. You never know how someone is going to react. I think a great example of this is MMOs, where you could be just killing monsters forever and ever, but you keep on going back because anytime you're playing with people, it's a different experience every time you experience it. So I definitely think that that's where games are going. It doesn't mean that the single-player games are going away, but I do think, what's happening is that even those single-player focused games are thinking of how to involve other people. So, maybe it's Twitch, maybe it's streaming your experience and chatting about it or watching your friend play. Maybe it's another way to create a role for the audience so that the player is kind of the actor in it, but there is a role for someone else watching it. So I think that even the games that are focused on single player are thinking of community or social features.
And what about different platforms? Because I know, Watch Dogs, they announced it was coming out at the end of May, and that game has a lot of interesting ideas about how you sort of can play on a tablet to sort of, mess with your friends and things like that. Now, when you guys approach games, I imagine you're thinking about, well, what's the mobile version of this game, or what's the tablet version of this game for a lot of the franchises, right? And that factors into sort of the breakthrough in some ways, right?
Yeah. So for the big, AAA franchises, we for sure think about all of those, all of the different devices and how it ties in and how we can, get the best experience of the player, and also if there are new opportunities to have a new breakthrough or, I think with Watch Dogs, for example, that kind of gameplay fits really well, right?
Yeah.
The hacking and the phone is already there, so what's the phone functionality, what's the tablet functionality?
When you guys look at those new platforms, and I'm sure some of the stuff you're working on may tie into that. I mean, are you looking at iPhone, iPad, tablet, mobile as a place where you guys want to build games as well that are dedicated to those devices?
Yes, definitely. And I think, there's a lot of interesting things going on those devices. And the devices, a good game on those devices is different from a good game on consoles. And so I really think that they do deserve their own franchises if you're going to, really leverage what the platform has to offer.
Right. What do you think people would take away as sort of the identity of Ubisoft Toronto?
I would love for Ubisoft Toronto to be known for innovation. And, that the way that we structured the teams is a little bit different. We're trying to run them as lean as possible with more of an entrepreneurial spirit where people are getting to explore a lot of things that they wouldn't normally. And, to use kind of, fail fast and often and really, try out a whole bunch of new things. So hopefully if those things pan out, we'll get to be known for innovation and a different approach. We haven't seen a whole lot of success of good movies coming from games, and we haven't seen a whole lot of success of good movies being made into good games. But I think that we've seen some good translations. I think to comics, and I think that Assassin's Creed and also the Splinter Cell comic was good, and they've been highly rated. But we've had a harder time with the movie to game and game to movie translation. I think there's this fundamental flaw that people sort of assume they know one media and they think that they know the other media.
Right.
And and I think, in my opinion, the key is really developing a universe, that's consistent and interesting and that has characters, but that also contains sandboxes where the experts in the other media can have an area where they can be creative and know how to, get to do what they do best. And I do think, with Assassin's Creed, what's been really great for us is because it has this meta story and, pockets of history that different teams can own. It also means that teams can have a lot of autonomy, and a new team can work on Assassin's Creed and still, as long as they're following the guidelines of the franchise, they can be quite creative and turn it in a new way. Like we never imagined when we were working on the first one that there would be a pirate assassin, for example. So I think that's the key. And so when we're working on a new franchise, for example, I don't think we can think right out the gate how is this going to be a movie or whatever, because I don't, I wouldn't feel comfortable personally doing that because that's not my expertise. I don't know how to make a good movie. I've never made a movie in my life, But what I do, I think you have to focus on making a good game and then also focus on these creative sandboxes where that there's certain guidelines that are clear that other teams can run with.
For you, when you think of games 3-4 years down the road, what do you think the industry is going to look like? What are the kind of experiences that you think are in the near future?
So, if I was thinking of a new franchise today, I would really focus more on fan participation and user-generated content. And when I say user-generated content, I don't mean making textures or making your own levels or, not that I have anything against making hats for Team Fortress, but I'm not talking about necessarily making hats. User-generated content to me it can be anything. It can be, in esports, it can be I'm making content because I'm making a match that other people want to see, or I'm playing the role of the announcer for this. Hey, you would be great at that, Geoff. So I think that really for the future, when you're building successful franchises of the future, it's not only about thinking about the different platforms and the different media, maybe transmedia or confluence of media, as I guess I would have been thinking about with the last generation. Now, with this new current generation, it's about thinking about the audience's role and thinking about, massively. One thing that's interesting to me is massively co-op.
Right.
What does that look like? I think that there's some interesting stuff in there. But yeah, I think you have to think of the social aspect, and you have to think of also tiered systems with the ability for people with different amounts of time, different amounts of interest to participate and also pay in different ways. So the question was, if Toronto has its own characteristics, right, as an indie game scene. So for any game development. Yeah, I think, what's great about Toronto is that there are fantastic schools. So, that's one thing that makes it great for indie game startups, because a lot of people are graduating from Waterloo, and U of T, some of the best programmers, and Sheridan, which is known worldwide for having some of the best animators and concept artists, and they're all, graduating, and, they can form these startups. And the other thing is there is great government support for games. So the government really believes in the games industry as important to invest in for the future. And so, any indie game startup can get the same kind of support that Ubisoft has. There's no real difference between, being Ubisoft or a big publisher coming into Ontario or, being a startup. So I think those two things together, people coming out of school are like, great, we can do this and we can afford to do this. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I'm wondering even for also like bigger studios, do you see more or Toronto getting a lot bigger in terms of
No more competition for you.
or just Ubisoft?
I think it would be good. I think that's the idea is Ubisoft set up in Montreal, and now, 15 years later, there are a whole bunch of other big studios there, and that's the hope with Toronto as well, because I think, it is, you might think it would be a disadvantage for Ubisoft then, but it isn't, because it's harder to convince people to move to Toronto, let's say that we're trying to recruit elsewhere, because then they think, well, if it doesn't work out or I don't like Ubisoft Toronto, then I've moved to Toronto and there's nowhere else for me to work. And it's good, it's easier for them if they know there's a whole ecosystem there.
Question is related to large team size, and Ubisoft is known for collaborations across 4, 5, 6 studios sometimes. The questioner is wondering if you have any thoughts on how to make that work, or lessons learned from that process.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there are definitely a bunch of best practices. But I'll boil it down to the two most important, I think. So one of them, I think, if you have a central team, let's say, and the other teams are working with you, let's say there's a lead team that's central. It's very important on the lead team to have a small team whose function is to make the other teams work easier. So that's facilitating communication, making sure that they have tech assistance from the core team, making sure that their technical questions are answered and that they're always up to date on game design or production decisions, and that they get it right away. Because I think, when the dev team is busy, they might forget to, but you have to remember those teams out there are starving for that info. They feel like they're very far away and they're not getting enough info, and even if you think it's mundane, they want to know. So having people that are dedicated to communicating and supporting those teams would be number one. The second thing I would say to have really successful collaboration is to define a standalone chunk of the game for those teams to have ownership and autonomy on, and to develop a relationship of trust so that those teams are trusted to deliver that portion. So I think ideally if you can set it up in a way where you say, what you guys are working on, if it's good, we'll include it in the game. If it's not, we won't, but it's yours, and they get clear guidelines, is key. Because if they're working on bits and pieces, and let's say design is still in the central team and they're not being trusted, you're not going to end up with anything good. But if they have the pride and they know it's them delivering it, and it's a clear part of the game that they can say they did, you're going to get great results, and they're incentivized to make it as good as possible because they know if it's not good, it's not going to be included in the game. That's how you get the best work, for sure. In terms of structured communication and more on the management side of things, I think that there, I think with a lot of small teams, you can take a lazier approach to structuring your team and your deliverables and your production methodologies, because you don't necessarily have to have very strong production methodologies. When you have a smaller team, you can just get up and talk to someone, and I 100% agree that's a great way to go. But I think it also is good to have a bit more discipline, and I definitely think that's something that the bigger projects have to do. When you're working with teams of 800 people across 6 different studios, you can't, you can't have an organic way of running your team or your milestones, or the way you do your design specs or any kind of specs. And I do think that those are the kinds of things, obviously scaled appropriately to the size of the indie team, but it's the type of thing that probably would be useful for any developers to brush up on the best practices.
The question was about diversity in games, and Jade's thoughts on that.
Well, I'm definitely a strong believer in building diverse teams. I think if you hire a bunch of people on your team who are all wearing the same t-shirt and the same baseball hat and same sneakers, you're probably not going to end up with a game that appeals to so many different people, right? So I think it starts by integrating different perspectives into your development, as what links to one of your earlier questions about playtesting or whatever. I think you can only really make decisions based on what you like yourself. So by involving different people, you'll make games that appeal to more different kinds of people.